Hi, everybody. This is only my second video, but I thought I'd respond to something that's been making the rounds in the debates between a lot of religious scholars. And those are the arguments of Bart Ehrman. Now, they're really fascinating, and I dove into them deeply. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of background myself, and then I'm going to talk about the arguments of Bart Ehrman and why I dislike them. The one thing that you should know is, in this video, what I'm going to use as my evidence is not the New Testament. So we're going to take the New Testament and we're going to essentially throw it out entirely. And we're only going to look at historical sources outside of the New Testament to debunk Bart Ehrman. All right, so first of all, a little bit of context about me. I am a university professor. I'm a manuscript reviewer. I'm an editor for several journals. I've reviewed probably between 500 to 1,000 different manuscripts over the last few years. I've also published about 50 manuscripts in the peer-reviewed literature, most of them as first author. Now, I should say that I am not a biblical scholar. I'm also not a historical scholar. So the arguments that I'm going to be making in this video are from more of a really an amateur perspective. So you should really only take these as amateur arguments and just do your own research. So my critiques of Bart Ehrman are not based on any kind of theological ground or philosophical ground. They're really just based on my experience as a researcher. All right, so that's a little bit of background about me. University professor, reviewed a lot of manuscripts, amateurish interest in the statements of Bart Ehrman. Let's now talk briefly about the statements of Bart Ehrman, why they've been gathering a lot of attention, and why they're kind of interesting to dive into. So he makes a lot of different statements. He's essentially an atheistic scholar in his historical perspective, so a lot of what he does is debunk Christianity. But what I'm more interested in is a specific body of writing that he's done about the life of Jesus, which I find to be very interesting from an academic perspective. I have an amateurish interest in the historicity of Jesus, and I like specifically looking at antagonistic sources about Jesus. So Bart Ehrman makes essentially 3 points about Jesus. Number one, he makes the point that Jesus never claimed to be divine during his own lifetime. Now, that's based on his reading of the New Testament. And we'll dive a little more into that, but basically Bart Ehrman's main thesis is that the theology around Jesus was an evolution of later Christianity, and essentially his main point is that Jesus never said he was divine. Second point that Bart Ehrman makes is that Jesus was executed indeed, and he was crucified, but he was probably crucified for political reasons and not religious reasons. The third point that Ehrman makes, which is kind of interesting, is again, I'm distilling some of his points from a lot of his different writings, but the third point that he makes is he posits that the New Testament is essentially an apologetic book towards the Romans. So he states that, or he strongly implies that the idea behind the New Testament is so that the early Christians would essentially gain a little favor with the Romans. Their purpose was to say, hey, look, we're being attacked by the Jews, not by the Romans, and we don't have any ill will towards the Romans, and that maybe this was an effort of early Christians to gain a little bit of favor with the Romans. So that's a very brief and terse distillation of 3 of Bart Ehrman's more interesting arguments about the historicity of Jesus. And specifically, those are the 3 arguments that we'll be addressing in this video. Now, I assume if you're watching this video, 2 things. Number one, I assume that you're already sort of familiar with the writings of Bart Ehrman, so I'm not going to use a lot of direct quotes from him. Number 2, I assume that you already are familiar with the counter-arguments against Bart Ehrman. Now, when I've reviewed those counter-arguments, I find some of them to be persuasive, but as you probably already know, almost all of those arguments are based on the New Testament. So what we're going to do for this video is we're going to throw the New Testament out completely, okay? So we're not going to use any evidence from the New Testament to disprove Bart Ehrman. Now, the one thing that we have to sort of include from the New Testament comes from Bart Ehrman's own analysis, which is that there was a sign above Jesus' head that says King of the Jews. That's an important point to Bart Ehrman because that's the justification that he uses for proving that the death of Jesus was indeed political and was not religiously motivated. So we can go ahead and admit that into evidence. But otherwise, None of this video's evidence is going to be invoking the New Testament at all. And the reason why I'm doing that is just because you are probably already familiar with all of the New Testament evidence debunking Bart Ehrman. You're probably familiar with the Christian apologetic perspective. So what we're going to try to do in this video is use more of a historical antagonistic perspective about the historicity of Jesus to debunk Bart Ehrman's claims, because I think that'll be more intellectually enriching. Now, I should say that if you're watching this video from a Christian perspective, that I hope that none of this portrayal is offensive at all. If you're watching this video as an atheist, I hope you find it interesting. My intention is really to strengthen the academic literature around the historicity of Jesus. And in this video in particular, it is not to sort of cast a pejorative light on anyone, so respect to Bart Ehrman, respect to all the historical researchers out there, and respect to even those of you who are maybe spiritually or religiously already have a set of beliefs that you ascribe to that you don't want shaken. This is not going to be a video that touches on anything that is, I think, spiritually or religiously contentious, and my perspective is purely to sort of incorporate a more academic perspective on the historicity of Jesus by looking at antagonistic sources. All right, so the first antagonistic source that I'll talk about just briefly is a book called the Toledot Yeshu. This is really not just one book. It's essentially a list of about 8 different variants of the same book, which is the Jewish anti-Jesus polemic. Now, this is a very interesting set of books. There's actually hundreds of different variants. There's 8 major versions. I've made a separate video about this book, and the one thing that you need to know about this book is it is essentially the Jewish refutation or disputation of Jesus. So this book is based on the reasons why the Jews said Jesus was, a false blasphemer, a heretic. So what are the things in the Toledot Yeshu that we can glean that are more likely to be true? Well, what I try to use in my other video that I make about the Toledot Yeshu is a minimal synthetic approach. So saying there's 8 different versions. What are the things that are common to all 8 different versions of the Toledot Yeshu? And if we have something that's common to all of the versions, it's a little more likely that we can say that those statements are reliably true if they resonate through all 8 versions. Now, by the way, briefly, it's probably important to let you know what the age of the Toledot Yeshu is for purposes of this video. Most of the copies that we have are sort of medieval in origin, so I would say starting in about the maybe 5th or 6th century all the way up to the 15th century. Those are the copies that we have. But the Toledot Yeshu is based on earlier oral teachings, so it was probably written, or at least originally taught, as early as the 2nd or 3rd century, and the versions in writing that we have are later than that. But we know, because there were 8 different versions from medieval times at least, that the tradition of the Toledot Yeshu and the oral teachings on which it's based are in fact much earlier than that. So here are just some quotes from some of the different versions of the Toledot Yeshu that endorse that Jesus did indeed initially claim to be divine from the outset. So from the Aramaic or Haldreich version of the Toledot Yeshu, which we have from the 9th and 11th century, Yeshu said to them, "I am the Son of God. I was born of a virgin. I will ascend to heaven and sit at the right hand of my Father." From the Wagon-Cell version, it states that he, Jesus, claimed to be God and led the people astray. Let his name be blotted out. That's referring to the name of Jesus, so this says clearly he claimed to be God. The Halkin recension, which is the Hebrew version that I've talked about in my other video, says that Jesus said, "By this name, the name of God, I will ascend to heaven as befits the Son of God." So again, claiming to be the Son of God. Maybe I'll just read one more version, which is the Western version of the Toledot Yeshu, where it says, he claimed, that's referring to Jesus before the people, "I am the light of the world, and no one comes to the Father but through me." Again, this was not the Jews saying, yes, this guy was correct in his claim of divinity. This is just the Jews saying, sort of mockingly, that Jesus was claiming to be divine, and obviously this was erroneous. So the Toledot Yeshu does go into several reasons why these were erroneous statements from Jesus, but the claim of divinity is again endorsed by all 8 versions of the Toledot Yeshu. Now, the next main argument against Bart Ehrman's thesis comes also from the early Jews. It's from Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who was a prominent rabbinic sage in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And Rabbi Eliezer was regarded as a great rabbi. A lot of his teachings are recorded in a book called the Tostefa. If you're not familiar with this book, it's essentially the Jewish oral teaching record, so it's like the Mishnah. So this is sort of considered a canonical source of Jewish teaching. So it's, the sort of canonical interpretation of the Bible. So anyways, the Tostefa, in it, Rabbi Eliezer refers to Jesus as a min, M-I-N, which is a word that sort of means heretic. But this word specifically refers to someone with divine pretensions. So it can be either unauthorized access to God's power or somebody who blasphemes against God. So that's clearly a very early recollection from something as early as around 70 AD, so within a few decades of Jesus, saying that indeed Jesus was known widely at that time to be someone who blasphemed, somebody who had divine pretensions, and somebody who had unauthorized, or someone who had unauthorized access to the power of God. So that is Rabbi Eliezer's testimony from as early as 70 AD, and he cites essentially what is an earlier teaching about Jesus. So we know that from the Jews' perspective, in the early decades after Jesus, it was well and widely understood that indeed Jesus had pretenses of divinity and was leading Israel astray for that reason. Now there's also the Talmudic testimony, the Talmud directly. This is from between the 2nd and 5th centuries, but again, it preserves an earlier oral tradition, possibly from the 1st or 2nd century. So we can date most of what the Talmud says to probably the 1st or 2nd century. Now, in this book, it said that Jesus was executed on the eve of Passover for the crimes of sorcery and leading Israel astray. Now, the specific word that the Talmud uses here is hisit. I won't try to pronounce the entire Hebrew phrase for what Jesus did, but the word that they use specifically is hisit. I'll put the whole phrase in the video. But this legal category of hisit applies to people who claim to be divine, or people who lead the Jews to worship idols falsely. So false idolatry falls under this category. Inciting false idolatry falls under this category. Claims of divinity directly also fall under this category. So again, this is the Talmud from Sanhedrin 43a, which verifies that Jesus did have pretensions of divinity. Another set of teachings we can look at is the Sanhedrin 107b, the Soda 47a, which depicts Jesus as turning to idolatry, learning magic, being rejected by other rabbinical teachers. And this writing about Jesus says specifically that there was a misuse of a divine claim by Jesus. So this essentially says that Jesus did make a divine claim which was misused and erroneous. Again, these are all pejorative writings about Jesus. These are all writings intended to negate Jesus, but they all sort of coalesce around the point that Jesus claimed to be divine, at least at some point. And this writing is very early as well, from the 3rd or 5th century, and again preserves an earlier teaching about Jesus. So far, we've just talked about the Jewish writings against Jesus. It's probably very relevant for me to point out that I hope that no one takes away from this video that this is a statement that should incite any anti-Semitism or any sentiment against the Jews at all. I'm merely looking at the early Jewish teachings about Jesus for the purpose of asking a question about the historicity of Jesus, which is, did Jesus claim to be divine? All right, so far we've just looked at Jewish sources. Let's now switch gears. We're going to turn our attention and look at Roman and pagan sources that also claim that Jesus was essentially a pretender to divinity. We can start with Celsus. He was maybe one of the earliest prolific critics of the early Christian movement. He was writing in about 170 AD, and Celsus refers to Jesus as a magician, somebody who gathered disreputable followers, and somebody who claimed divinity. Celsus specifically states in a work that cites him as he proclaimed himself to be God. So here we have an unequivocal testimony early on from Celsus in the mid-2nd century where he says Jesus proclaimed himself to be God. We can also look at Tacitus. Now, this is a bit of an interesting set of writings by Tacitus, but he was writing a little bit earlier, and in his book called Annals in 116 AD, he refers to Christianity as a mischievous superstition. Now, the crime that he ascribes to Jesus is the crime of superstitio, and again, I'll put the full Roman term in the video so that I don't have to pronounce it. But so now this crime refers to something that's very specific, which is unauthorized religious devotion of a new deity. So in this writing, Tacitus is actually endorsing that Jesus was encouraging the religious devotion to a new deity, and that was Jesus' crime. So here we have a very early recording in 116 AD saying that yes, indeed, Jesus did claim to be divine. Porphyry is another writer who gets often cited. He's a little bit later, writing in about 270 AD. He also endorses that Jesus claimed to be divine. He denies the validity of this claim. Obviously, he's a critic of the Christians, but he critiques the Christians as worshiping Jesus as God, which shows that the Christian worship of Jesus as God was a very early thing that happened. And he also agrees that Jesus presented himself on his own to be divine, and he denies the validity, saying that Jesus was killed by the Roman authorities appropriately in the terms of Porphyry because he was claiming to be divine. So that's another statement from somebody very early on who endorses that Jesus did indeed claim to be divine. We can look at a few other early critics like Lucian of Samosata. He satirically describes Christianity, so he's somebody who's ridiculing Christianity, writing between 160 to 180 AD or CE, if you like. And he says that the early Christians were denying the pagan gods and worshiping instead someone who presented himself as a divine figure. So he reflects also the early on Greco-Roman perception that Jesus was presented as a deified figure, both by himself and also by early Christians. Now, another argument that I'll invoke here is it's interesting to note that the argumentation that Jesus did not present himself as divine really starts with the 14th century in the Gospel of Barnabas, which was an apocryphal gospel. I won't go into a lot of details about it, but it's now well known to be a historically inauthentic work. It's interesting to me that it's only more recently that we've sort of resurrected this argument that Jesus never claimed to be divine. But to me, as an amateur historical scholar and an amateur person with interest in the historicity of Jesus, that the arguments about Jesus' claim to be divine surface now in modern times and much later. So for me, arguments that are earlier sort of inherently carry a lot more weight, especially because we have so many of them and they're all so congruent with each other. So that's sort of one of the big issues that I have. Anyone who really tries to recontextualize or redefine what Jesus said or did, we're looking through a lens of a lot of history. And I think, if we come up with a new statement or a new conclusion about Jesus, it really should be weighed against the older arguments that we have and the older analysis that we have. All right, so let's talk about one other argument that Bart Ehrman disproves Bart Ehrman's logic, and that is the problem of all the other early Jewish figures who claimed to be the leaders of the Jews and who led revolts against the Romans, who were not treated as heretics or blasphemers by the Jews. There's three major figures early on that come to mind. One is, I'm probably mispronouncing some of these names, but one is Simon Bar Kokhba in 135 AD. He led a revolt against the Romans. He was not reviled or hated by the Jews. There's no anti-Simon Bar Kokhba literature. So he was not vilified. He was not viewed as a heretic. Judas the Galilean in 6 AD and Theudas in the 40s AD also led uprisings against the Romans. They were never accused of apostasy. They were never accused by the Jews of having any divine pretensions. They were not accused by the Jews to be heretics. They were not accused of being blasphemers. So, in other words, there were leaders of the Jews, or people who were self-appointed leaders, who were not viewed as heretics or blasphemers before and also after Jesus. And in a time frame which is very contemporary to Jesus. So very early before Jesus, very close in proximity to the time of Jesus, and very close in proximity after the time of Jesus. So that to me means that there must have been something different about Jesus. So there must have been some statement that Jesus made, or some collection of statements that Jesus made, that caused the Jews at the time to be much more upset with Jesus than they were with these other leaders. So this is one area where Bart Ehrman's analysis breaks down. Another important consideration for the breakdown of Bart Ehrman's analysis is that it does rely heavily on the argument that crucifixion is specifically something that is reserved for political prisoners. So Bart Ehrman's analysis concludes that because Jesus was crucified, that's strong evidence that Jesus was a political figure and was not indeed a religious or spiritual figure. So let's now critically take a look at that argument itself. Again, this argument is not supported by the historical literature that we know about. We have many historians on several different sides of the religious and historical perspective who all endorse that crucifixion was more widely used as a punishment and was not just reserved for political ideologues specifically. You can look at Suetonius, who describes crucifixion for slaves and also for common criminals. You can look at Seneca, who writes that crucifixions are common. They're used for citizens and specifically, they're used for, criminals, and specifically also used for non-citizens. You can look at the writings of Cicero. This refers to crucifixion being commonly used for slaves. Anyone who is sort of a freed slave or a slave who escaped their slavery was considered an especially egregious threat. Highway robbers and bandits were also crucified. They were also described to be threats. Josephus is also someone who describes mass crucifixions of Jewish civilians during the siege of Jerusalem just to prove a point, to quash a rebellion. There were slaves that were crucified. There were bandits. There were pirates who were also crucified. So there are several examples of crucifixion being used for crimes other than pretending to be a political leader. It's probably worth briefly mentioning that there are early Christian sources that talk about the context of crucifixion as something that is reserved for lowly criminals. But again, in this video, for purposes of this video, we can just throw those all out the window. If you want, you can look them up. Justin Martyr, Tertullian say that crucifixion was more widely used, but I think the purpose of this video is to more focus on antagonistic literature. All right, finally, we're going to look at 3 flaws in Bart Ehrman's analysis directly that are logical flaws that I think are just internal to the argumentation that he makes. Now, the first big flaw, we've talked about several, which, the problems with saying that crucifixion is just reserved for political leaders. But the other problem is he does not, in his own analysis, present Jesus as a convincing political leader. In other words, what was Jesus' political platform? What was his statement? What statements did he make against the Romans? There's no real evidence that Jesus took any kind of unique stance against the Romans. And Ehrman's own analysis doesn't really endorse that Jesus was a political ideologue, that he had a social platform, that he had a political platform, that he was advocating for any political change or any specific political revolution. So that, I think, is a major gap in Ehrman's analysis. The other major gap in Ehrman's analysis, which I think is one of the main points of this video, is that he argues that Jesus' body was discarded and that the hallucinations, and that the reason why people perceived Jesus to be resurrected were because of hallucinations. Now, this is a fascinating point. Other thinkers and other psychologists and other multidisciplinary analyses have come out to say, yes, the resurrection of Jesus was an apparent hallucination, or no, it wasn't, or no, it couldn't have been. My field of expertise is more aligned with the medical field, so I would argue that there's not enough evidence that Jesus' resurrection was merely a hallucination. But my point here is not to make that argument. My point is to say that Ehrman's analysis on that point is really inconclusive and incomplete. And the problem is that he invokes that step in his logic as a major important chain in his analysis. So unfortunately, he has a huge chain in his analysis, which is very, very weak, which breaks down upon further inspection. I think if Ehrman wanted to make the case that Jesus' apparent resurrection was definitely hallucination, his analysis should have been more multidisciplinary, or he should have brought in other people in some other way to support his thinking. And the reason why this is important is because this is where Ehrman would probably make the distinction between Jesus and other leaders who were not reviled by the Jews. He would say that, well, the problem was that there was this perceived resurrection episode that happened, and that's why the Jews specifically reviled Jesus. But the problem is his explanation for why there was a perceived resurrection breaks down. And so there is a big gap in his logical analysis. The other problem that Ehrman creates in his own analysis internally is one of the major steps in the sort of mechanistic causality of Ehrman's conjecture of the history at the time is that Jesus' body was discarded. And he says that specifically to sort of accept his bigger picture analysis of what happened with Jesus, you have to sort of accept that Jesus' body was discarded. Now, the problem is, again, I won't go into a whole lot of detail about this, but the first problem with this is that Ehrman doesn't offer any supportive analysis on this point. The second problem with this is that it does contradict, again, a mountain of Jewish literature. For example, just off the top of my head, all 8 different versions of the Toledot Yeshu say that Jesus' body disappeared for a time. Now, the Jews are not endorsing that Jesus was resurrected. In fact, their argument that Jesus' body disappeared was based on their account that his disciples stole his body. That's in some different variations. Or the argument that the gardener stole the body. That's in some other variations. But the Jews very specifically believed that the body disappeared. It was unaccounted for a while. It was removed from a tomb, according to every version of the Toledot Yeshu. It not only disappeared, but was moved from a tomb. And although the Jews explain this, Bart Ehrman's analysis runs contrary to this. So you have yet another example of a situation where it's a major causal link in Ehrman's analysis, and he doesn't support it at all. And in fact, he argues something that's counter to the accepted historical narrative by other sources, including antagonistic sources. All right, so that brings this video to a close. I don't want to go on too much longer, but I do want to underscore what is the main point of this video. Why am I making a video debunking Bart Ehrman? The reason is this. There is, I think, a fairly large problem in the atheist community, which is that most of the major atheist thinkers come to a scientific, scholarly, philosophically analytical perspective, but they do so with the first step of their journey being made through an anti-theistic framework. So if you look at Bart Ehrman, he sort of typifies this. So he went into Christian studies, he went into New Testament scholarship after he became an atheist. He was in seminary, he pursued a course as a Christian minister, he decided he didn't believe in Jesus anymore, and then he said, I'm going to become a New Testament scholar to disprove the New Testament. Now, I really think that this is problematic. If you're going to study the New Testament as a scholar from a perspective of historical scholarship, you should be more neutral on the New Testament. Unfortunately, I think secular scholarship on the New Testament is beleaguered by how many people go into that field from an initially anti-theistic or atheistic perspective. And I think that's why Bart Ehrman's analysis ultimately suffers. Now, there are only really 2 other explanations for why Ehrman's analysis would be so flawed. In other words, if I, as a historically amateur scholar, can come up with all these arguments to indicate that Bart Ehrman was wrong, I'm clearly not uncovering new historical research. This is research that would be known to any historical scholar. So the question then becomes, why does Bart Ehrman not reconcile himself with these beliefs? Why does he not talk about the literature, the evidence that he himself must know is out there? This is all commonly known historical scholarship that I'm citing. These are not new ideas that I'm bringing up for the first time ever. And Ehrman does not deal with a lot of this analysis. He doesn't talk about the Jewish literature. He doesn't talk about the early Roman documentation that Jesus claimed to be divine. He doesn't talk about other political leaders who did not claim to be deified in anywhere and did not claim to be divine, and how they were not reviled by the Jews. So the fact that Ehrman doesn't address this is, I think, something that exposes that he has an inherent bias. So I think he's either presenting his research in a way that's disingenuous or in a way that is really incompetent by not including a lot of the other research that's out there. Again, I've heard him lecture. I think he's an intelligent individual, so I'm not putting this conclusion out there to pejorate Bart Ehrman. I'm just saying that there are gaps in his analysis, and they are pretty obvious gaps. All right, well, that concludes this video. Again, I hope I've not said anything offensive to either side in this video. My interest is sort of amateur historical interest in the historicity of Jesus, and I'm happy to take more questions in the comments section. This is one of my first videos, so if you have any thoughts on this video, let me know what you think. If you have any suggestions for things I can tackle next, what do you think? Feel free to put your questions, comments, or suggested topics in the comment section of this video. And lastly, I'd really love to know what your thoughts are on this. After digesting this argument, does this change your mind? Do you think that it's less likely that Jesus claimed to be divine, or do you think it's more likely? Are there other historical sources that I should have cited that I didn't? There are definitely other sources that I came across in my research that I didn't cite in the interest of time. But let me know what you think. Do you think Jesus claimed to be divine? Do you think he didn't claim to be divine? And I'm specifically interested in what your background is. If you're an atheist and you believe that Jesus claimed to be divine, or you believe that Jesus didn't claim to be divine, I'm interested in either side of that. If you're a Christian and you believe that Jesus didn't claim to be divine, that's certainly very interesting, and I'd love to learn more about that as well. So let me know what you think in the comments section, and thanks very much for supporting this video. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.